While we're waiting, I just want to let everyone know that you are welcome to turn on the meeting chat kind of off to the side, and that would be a great place to drop any questions that you have during our panelists' presentation. Also, if you want to say hi to everyone who's here, like Kathy did. I think for the sake of time and respecting everybody who's here tonight, I do want to go ahead and get started. So I will do that by introducing myself and V. Ramos. We are both from A Second Cup, and we will be facilitating tonight just by kind of monitoring the technology and asking some questions. My name is Catherine Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of Strategy and Impact for A Second Cup. I hope most of you who are here or watching know what we do, but if you don't, we would love to give you an opportunity to learn more about what A Second Cup does. Tonight, we are going to be having a conversation about prison abolition, but let me pass it over to V to give some other beginning statements.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And I want to thank the panelists for their time to participate in this discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to take just about a minute of your time to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the indigenous land of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. We acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the traditional land of several tribal nations, including the Karankawa, Kwawitlakan, Atacapa, Ishka, and Sana peoples past and present. We recognize this land was occupied and seized, the tribal people killed, and their culture stolen. This affects us all to this day. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This land acknowledgement must not end here. We must acknowledge our individual duty and lifelong commitment in continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit. And now we'll go ahead and take about 8 minutes, just a few minutes for each panelist to introduce themselves briefly. And whoever would like to get started and hop in, please do.
Okay, well, I'm Michelle. I'm here for lived experience. I was incarcerated. I've been incarcerated 3 times in my life, and for minor possession and more moral crimes of moral turpitude, nothing extremely violent. So I can speak to that experience. I now work in social services. I work for 211. I'm in school to complete my my BA in social work. Also working on my certification for project management. I have you guys on 2 screens, so if you see me looking over there, that's where I am. And I'm happy to be here. That's a little bit about me.
Well, I guess I'll go. I'm Jennifer Varela. Hello, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a licensed clinical social worker, supervisor, and for the last 2 years, I've been in private practice, and my specialties include trauma and grief. But before that, for 25 years, I worked as an embedded social worker at the Harris County DA's office, and primarily in victim services in domestic violence and sex crimes. So I just have a lot of experience working with people who've been hurt in that way, and also within the criminal justice system. So I think understand not only how it works, but how it works from the inside on a very, person-to-person type way, kind of how people think, as well as, maybe what we see, maybe policies, but I feel like I'm very familiar with really the values and the attitudes and the things that are not going to show up in a policies and procedure manual. So that's, I guess, what I have to offer. And thank you for allowing me to be here. And I hope I can contribute.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Melissa Elena Maldonado Torres. I am an adjunct professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, where I sometimes teach the human trafficking course that I was lucky enough to develop during my PhD, where I did my doctorate looking at sex trafficking of Latinas in Houston and Los Angeles area cantinas. I'm now an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and the research lead for their anti-human trafficking program. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very, very excited that View is one of my students, and we spent time talking about this topic, and I'm so glad that she's bringing it to light.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Della. I'm Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston and a social worker. Are you all getting echo on me, or does it sound okay? Okay, sounds better now. I'm also a social worker. I started my career working in the Child Protective Services system. And then when I went into academia, spent many years researching that system and learning how to, or trying to think of ways to reform that system, and ultimately came to the conclusion that that system is not reformable, and have spent many years as a student of abolition, learning about the broader prison abolitionist movement to apply that work to abolition of the child welfare system, which we refer to as the family policing system. And then a few years ago became involved in launching what's called the Upend movement, which is a movement focused on abolition of the child welfare or family policing system, and have used a lot of the theory and praxis that's been developed about prison and policing abolition to inform that work, and ultimately see all of those systems as part of the broader carceral state. Prisons, policing, foster care are all part of the mechanism used by the state to oppress Black and brown people. But happy to be here tonight, and really excited to be sharing the team screen with all of you.
Awesome. We are very honored to have all of you here as our panelists, bringing your various perspectives and lenses that you do, each of you from different and similar spheres. For a few people who have just joined us, my name is Catherine, and I am one of the co-executive directors of the Second Cup. Our mission as a Second Cup is to work in the anti-trafficking movement through and end human trafficking through awareness, partnership, and aftercare. And one of the ways that we do that is by looking at issues that intersect with human trafficking and try to understand human trafficking on a very deep and complicated level. And so that's what we want to do tonight, is we want to talk about the prison system and looking at that and how that might intersect or relate to our anti-trafficking work. So I want to, sorry, I got a little bit distracted just trying to do some technology stuff, so I apologize, but it looks like we are good. Please do feel free. Technology is what it is. So if there's something that's going on that I don't know, please feel free to let me know and drop it in our chat. I will do the best I can to make sure everybody is able to focus in here. So I will then now pass it over to V to get us started.
A quick reminder, if anyone has any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to drop them into the chat, and Catherine will be reading those towards the end of the discussion. So to begin this discussion, I'd like us all to understand what labor trafficking is and briefly review the types of prison labor that are still occurring. The United States defines labor trafficking as a recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, and or debt bondage. The most common type of prison labor is institutional. These are the jobs that support the operations of the prison or detention facility. They may include cooking, cleaning, laundry, landscaping, and other jobs. And most of this work is for low pay, on average about 14 cents to 63 cents an hour, or no pay at all. Without the use of this free or heavily discounted labor, the facility would need to hire a civilian employee to do the work at market rate. This difference in pay translates into a profit for the state or private company that is incarcerating individuals, creating an incentive to continue incarcerating them. The second type of labor incarcerated individuals typically perform is working for either a state or federal government correctional industry, businesses or corporations run by the government that operate in correctional facilities and utilize incarcerated individuals as free or cheap laborers. The type of work can include manufacturing, furniture building, agriculture, making license plates or signs, and making uniforms or apparel. Most products from correctional industries can only be sold to government agencies and nonprofits within the state. The exception, however, is for agricultural goods, which can be sold to anyone, including directly to consumers. The third type of labor incarcerated individuals perform affects a smaller number, approximately about 5,000 nationwide, who work for private companies through a program called the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program. This program allows private companies to contract with state governments to hire incarcerated individuals. Large companies such as Victoria's Secret, Walmart, Microsoft, Starbucks, and Whole Foods have or had products produced with prison labor in their supply chains, typically through subcontractors' use of incarcerated individuals' work. Now, before we move on to the next question, if anyone has any thoughts or would like to comment on the definition of human trafficking and the types of prison labor, please do so.
Well, I think it's important to note that when we talk about these systems and these prisons, it's not just prisons, but also detention centers that are operated by the same industries. When we talk about people who are currently under that definition of prison labor and labor trafficking, it's also immigrants who are also awaiting their due process and having their cases heard as well. So just a reminder for that. We're not just talking about the prison system is a complex system, and it's not specifically just for quote unquote criminals, and we can talk about that part as well later. But also something else to remember is that a huge part of their profits not only comes from the incarceration of individuals, but what they call community care programs. So that's a lot of the follow-up. So the parole, the daily check-ins, the ankle monitors. We've heard it said that the largest in Harris County, especially the largest providers of healthcare are prison systems. So their medical and mental health facilities as well are under these complexes. It's an entire industry. So we're not just talking about the experience of someone being incarcerated for a crime and using that prison labor as a form of punishment. This goes beyond that very narrow definition of it.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Torres. And I think, Professor Varela, I'm not sure if you're trying to speak, but you're muted if you are.
Oh, sorry. Hello. Hi. Thank you, Michelle. I was just saying that I'm very interested to hear your perspective, since you likely participated in these kind of things, I'm guessing.
True. It's wonderful that the Professor, Miss Melissa, that you spoke on the community monitoring systems. I have a monitor currently. And though my fees were waived due to, I went into Angela's house, which is a secondary service, and they knew that I couldn't work while I was there. I know many individuals who pay fees
Oh, yeah.
to be monitored. But when I was in the WHO, which was an intensive treatment facility in a correctional facility, we not only served the food, we got it off the trucks, we did the gardening, we actually policed ourselves. It was what they call, there was a hierarchy there. I ended up being the elder. And what we were told to do is to drop tickets or monitor the other inmates and tell when they did something. The staffing, I think at a time there may have been at night 2 staff members there. And we were responsible for watching the other inmates, which is very odd. And also when it came down to doing our, because it was supposed to be a treatment facility, we led the groups with paperwork that they gave us. So yeah, now while I'm not, and I'm going to be very transparent on that, I'm not totally into abolishing all prison systems. I really believe that the person I am today is because of my experience there, negative as it may have been, but it spurred in me a change that has been lasting. And that is due to the harsh conditions that are there. It's not supposed to be fun. But I can get on board with the forced labor. Often we're put in danger. I've never been, we actually created the field by using shovels and manual labor to uproot grass. And if you've talked to anyone, I don't know how many conversations you have with someone who's had that experience of going to a penitentiary or a more long-term facility, they call it the hoe squad. And it's because you use a hole to make a track. And if there's anything that can be compared to it, it is slavery. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Michelle. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question. The next question is, how does the definition of prison labor intersect with human trafficking?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this issue like some of the other people here. So this is not but my thought is, when we're just thinking about labor in general, and Michelle, you said something that I thought was really important. You talked about safety, like work safety. So I think the less rights that workers have, whatever jobs those may be, we're more likely to see safety concerns in those kind of jobs and taking advantage of people. So the less freedoms and power that people have generally, when we just think about labor, I feel like the less they're going to be paid and the more unsafe it's likely to be, because you don't have options. So like Michelle, when you're in that place, if they're giving you something unsafe to do, or you feel like it doesn't feel safe, what are your options about dealing with that issue?
There are penalties to not adhering, whether it's privileges such as visitation with your family, being taken away from not adhering to those rules. After being there 6 months, you were allowed a furlough. If you had too many write-ups or marks against your record, you weren't able to do that. You weren't able to go out and spend time with your children. So those are when you're incarcerated, those things are so important. Commissary can be taken away, which is food that you choose. And when I say that we were serving the food, that means that we were getting it out. It was Aramark, and not to besmirch their name, we probably didn't get the quality food, but some of the food had weevils or maggots in it, and we were really told to pick them out and serve it anyway, and to know that that's going on in this modern day and age in one of the most food rich countries we have, it's terrible. And it's a totally different world. And you're often, what are you going to do? Are you going to write to your family and your family make noise, and then you're in the power of the system and not really able to defend yourself? There's retaliation, you know.
Yeah.
If you make a lot of noise, and not only do you get punished, but maybe your whole dorm, and then there's retaliation from your inmates and your counterparts. So it's not a good situation.
Yeah. So to me, that's a comparison. It's this, whatever labor we're talking about, the fact that, Michelle, you would lose time with your family potentially, which is, I'm sure, incredibly important to you. Perhaps if you made a legitimate comment about, hey, this isn't, we shouldn't be serving food with bugs in it, or, something of that nature. But to me, it seems like it's the lack of power. It's the lack of ability to say, I don't want to do unsafe work. I won't do unsafe work, or, can we do this work a different way? And I think a lot of immigrants are in that position, undocumented immigrants, of having to do work that is not safe and low pay and not having options. And I see the same with human trafficking. That's how I see the similarities.
I can add, for me, when I see the definition that you read, of labor trafficking, to me, it's not that the definition of prison labor intersects with human trafficking. They're literally the same thing. The definition that you just put in the chat, the United States defines labor trafficking as recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining a person for labor or services through fraud or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude. This is what prisons do. They obtain and harbor people for the purpose of labor through force and coercion. And I think it's important to just acknowledge when we think about this connections, to go back to the origins of policing and prisons, the origins of the 13th Amendment, which said that slavery was outlawed, or neither slavery nor involuntary servitude were allowed in the United States, except as punishment for crime. So what we saw happen is, after abolition of slavery, it created this massive loss of free labor, which had a really big impact on people's capital. But because of the provision in the 13th Amendment, which allowed the slavery of people who are incarcerated to continue, we saw a massive increase in policing and the prison population in order to replace that labor. So basically, the end of slavery led to the passage of the Black Codes. Through this loophole in the 13th Amendment, except as punishment for crime, that basically led to the idea that if all we need to do is make Black people criminals, to put them back into slavery is to make them criminals, then that's what we'll do. And then we'll have our source of free labor again. So prison labor is human trafficking, state-sanctioned human trafficking.
And so to piggyback off of that, I want to add that the 13th Amendment actually says everything that Dean Detlaff said, except it also includes that for which a crime that they have been duly convicted. And that's something else that we can discuss, because not everyone in the prison system has actually been convicted of the crimes that they are incarcerated for. And even that generates more money off of them, attorneys, the time that they're there, and, Ms. Michelle mentioned time with your family and commissary. That's all money that your families are, putting on your books and that they have to pay for. Meanwhile, you're working in the prison system and you're not earning that money, to even cover that. If there's supposed to be a fee, like, I'm not even earning money to cover that for myself. My family's the one that has to be doing this. So again, for which they're duly convicted, and the majority of people within the prison system still haven't even been to trial and have not been convicted of their crime. So that's something that I think gets swept under the rug a lot when we're talking about the prison system and especially trafficking. So prison labor literally is state-sanctioned slavery that tied to trafficking. I'm not sure if we'll mention the language behind modern-day slavery, but just to stress, slavery is trafficking. Not all trafficking is slavery. prison labor still is a form of slavery that is legally covered by the U.S. Constitution. Again, not carried out the way it said that it's supposed to be, but it's still a part of what human trafficking would be today. And again, if this were part of any kind of rehabilitative program or process that the prison industry says that it is, there are, again, those dangerous situations, precarious situations that some laborers in prison are subjected to. There are some who are literally trained and thrown out there to be firefighters without having, that prior experience. When they get out, they can't put that on any form saying that they've had this training and are now actually experienced as firefighters. This isn't a program that's like any kind of vocational training. That's not something that you go out there and say, I have this experience in work. This is literally, forced and coerced labor that's happening. So I've said this for years and I'll keep saying it. I think if you're actually in the fight against trafficking, you have to be in the fight against the current prison and carceral systems that we have.
Can I add? So, Michelle, one of the things you said where you talked about crime, and then Melissa, you talked about being duly convicted. So, the program that Michelle was in, the WHO program, I mean, I've been away from criminal justice for a couple of years, but that was, when I was there, it was called Women Helping Ourselves. Yeah. And as I recall, people might not have been convicted. They might still be they might have been on probation in that program. I'm pretty sure.
You're correct. The conviction, well, I had deferred adjudication. It is now, if I get hire an attorney, will come off my record because I completed the program. Right. But yes, I was there and it was offered. I just have to add this because I agree with what you're saying, but it's also the systematic breaking down of your psyche. As a Black woman, as a poor person, we were financially challenged growing up. I saw in my neighborhood, I now live in Memorial, and the amount of policing that is done in the neighborhood where I grew up for minor crimes, such as standing outside the store holding maybe a beer.
Yep.
Or is just overdone, and it makes us either lean far to the right or to the left. I believe there has to be a balance there. Some crimes, what I see and who I see gets taken advantage of are people who are drug addicts, alcoholics, those minor crimes, and then they get these longer sentences, are willing to sign because the county jail is horrible. You're locked up, you're not able to do any movement. And so you're willing to go to one of these farms, and once you're there, the process begins to systematically break down who you think you are, and I have seen people who've been comfortable in that environment and have returned because there's nothing else out here for them, because not only are you leaving after having to do the forced labor, you now have these mental chains. And you're not able to get government benefits. You're not able to get employment. You're not able to get housing because you have a criminal background for charges that are, not. You should not have received that much time for. You're either on probation, so you're limited on where you can work, and you return. So the recidivism rate, because of what's going on, it exacerbates it, and I think it perpetuates it. I think it's designed to continue that revolving door.
And Michelle, one of the things you said was, like you're saying, like alcohol and drugs crimes, those should not be crimes. Those are health issues, and so what we have done is we have moved all these health issues into the criminal justice setting. And I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of reasons for that, which are not good reasons. So what ends up happening is we have prosecutors, we have lawyers and judges turning into treatment providers. So if you go, say you get arrested, you're right. So like in a neighborhood that's over policed, you're standing around, you get arrested, you've maybe got some, not you personally, but maybe you've got some drugs on you, so then you get offered this program because they're going to help you, right? We don't, like, to me, and I've worked in the system, and I didn't always think this way. I'll admit, and I'm sad to admit, but I didn't always think this way. I didn't see it. But to me, like, putting somebody in this WHO program for drugs, it makes as much sense to me as putting someone with cancer in that program. You've got cancer, so we're going to send you, to this criminal justice program. And if you don't get better, we're gonna raise the stakes. You might end up going to prison. And so you're right. The whole, and Alan, you're right. The whole system is just so wrong.
Thank you everyone for sharing. To backtrack a little bit to what Dr. Doctora Torres was saying earlier, the next question is about the phrase modern day slavery. So there are many organizations, even government entities, that use the phrase modern day slavery. And Doctora Torres, I know specifically you shared something about this in the course that we had on human trafficking, and which I think it was the very first day, you came in and you made it very clear that you were an abolitionist, and that, this phrasing is problematic, and how it was used as a marketing scheme amongst white feminism movements that really took hold of human trafficking movements. And I would love if you could share something similar to that, or any thoughts that you feel are important to this conversation on why it is problematic, or the impacts of it. I said problematic, but what are the impacts of using modern day slavery as we're working within the human trafficking community?
Sure. I think, and B, you can correct me on this. I think what I mentioned in class was two sides to it: the actual legal side and definitions of slavery and trafficking, and then more like impact and understandings or contextual use of it. So as I said before, as with like the 13th Amendment, and with the TVPA, the federal trafficking policy, from which first one was in 2000, human trafficking, slavery is included in the definition, but there's other forms of labor or exploitation, we should say, beyond slavery. So there's the coercion, it's not situations where there's that force, right? Or like, it's not like there's another option, but for some reason this is the option that you're being coerced to take, because someone has that power over you in that situation. So again, legally, slavery is trafficking. Not all trafficking is slavery. The contextual piece of that, and I'll include a little bit about abolitionism. These are words that have been co-opted by the anti-trafficking movement. This is modern day slavery. I'm a modern day abolitionist, and yet we're not talking at all about prison labor or carceral systems, or even the racism that it still takes part today in a lot of anti-trafficking efforts. So abolitionism actually started from free Black churches, in fighting slavery, and then the consequential policing systems that came from that Dean Vela had touched up on. And now it's being used by a lot of like modern white churches of talking about, we're ending sex trafficking of young girls. Because it's a very specific trafficking that people are focusing on in these campaigns and in these movements. When you actually want to bring up the racism, when you actually want to bring up slavery, for me, the use of modern day slavery, and this is my opinion, it's a very whitewashed understanding, and whitewashes the history of slavery as well. This is historical. that context is historical and even in policy. You know, the first federal legislation that we had that to use the word trafficking about humans was the White Slave Traffic Act, to focus specifically on, let's move away from talking about Black chattel slavery and focus on specifically white immigrant women who are being trafficked for sex or exploited for sex. The assumption, because a lot of them were actually sex workers working of their own volition. So there's been this appropriation of historically free Black movements about systems that have been oppressing minoritized populations historically, to now make it about a very specific type of trafficking and a very specific type of victim. And again, this isn't new. This has been happening over 100 years. A lot of the policies still haven't changed and become, you know, we've become slightly more inclusive, but definitely not fully understanding of the systems. And the approach is still from a criminal justice lens, as a lot of legislation is. So yeah, for me, I'm sorry, I have a 5-month-old puppy if you hear his squeaky toy. For me, the issue here is, you want to talk about slavery, let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about that history. Let's talk about how we've gotten to where we are, including those policies that have then come you know, from slavery. The White Slave Traffic Act was a response to the Emancipation Proclamation. It was only about 60, 65 years after, to tell people, hey, suddenly we care about slavery, but it's more when it's white women, or, you know, these poor immigrant women, and when it's for sex. Because that mentality still hadn't changed. You know, it's not, after decades, centuries of slavery, you know, having to now tell people white slaves is what we're going to care about now. Let's talk about that history, and let's talk about the impact, you know, that it's had now on trafficking. Just simply calling it modern day slavery and saying I'm a modern day abolitionist and not paying attention to those foundations of which it came from is completely whitewashing who is highly at risk, who is most at risk, and who is most impacted by a lot of the legislative efforts against trafficking.
Melissa, I'm almost like want to laugh as you're talking. Not that what you're saying is funny, but just how this idea of modern, it really has been co-opted. And you know, when I think about working with some of these you know, anti-trafficking groups, you know, they do have a very specific type of person in mind. And you know, even a lot of the graphics, if you go to their websites, it'll be a row of white young women with their hair, you know, blowing in the breeze. You're right. That's the, you know, that's the slavery they want to talk about. I think that's an excellent point, and I agree with you 100%. Thank you.
I totally love what you shared, Dr. Torres, because I have a eclectic group of friends, and many times when I'm in the room, I'm the only one that looks like me. And it's always, no matter how close we grow, a tender subject. And to talk about slavery. And as I'm raising my daughter, we were watching a film about Harriet Tubman, and she could not quite grasp it because we don't talk about it. I don't talk about it with her, you know, and so I'm not in any way passing the buck, but in order to get along, and when it's not immediately affecting me, I'm not talking about it. So I appreciate the fact that you'll ask the hard questions, have the hard conversations that need to be had, because that's what's going to have to take place. Because a lot of time when you say whitewash, it's not only people of other colors, people who aren't ethnic that do it. It's also us. It's also us, because I don't want to be the angry Black woman. You know, I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, but it's uncomfortable and has to be talked about. So definitely there is a little twinge I get when someone says modern day slavery, because it takes it takes away something that's so much a part of my being and my ancestors being. I don't compare it. Native Americans, Jewish people, we have all there. So many indigenous tribes have been, genocide. Look what's going on. But in America, I don't believe that there's another story that's comparable to that of the Black race, the Black African American person. And we just don't talk about it anymore because no one wants to step on anyone's toes. But thank you for doing that.
And I just want to stress that when I say whitewashed, I mean systemically.
Mhm.
The people who have held the narrative systemically through legislation, through education, through the retelling of history, even, those of us who are representative of universities, institutions. And we talk a lot about even responses to trafficking, which largely are either from a criminal justice or a public health lens. Those are two systems that are historically racist and have been founded on the exploitation of Black and brown bodies. Like Dean Detlef shared about the history of policing, and also the history of so much of we know of modern, medicine is founded on experimenting on Black and brown bodies. So these are still systems that, when we talk about who we're trying to quote unquote, rescue, save, or help, in these situations. These are the people who aren't trusting of these systems because historically, we have this history with those systems. But if we don't discuss it, and I definitely agree with what you said, yes, it's uncomfortable, but if we don't discuss it, this is how we repeat things. When I see a lot of modern campaigns for trafficking, I think back to a lot of the research I've done on historically the context of what's happened before. I'm not sure if I shared this in the video, but I just got back home to the border, and the town where I'm in has a historical marker of La Matanza and the killing and lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the early 1900s. And, by the Texas Rangers. These are things that we're still fighting to include in history books. If we don't talk about them, these kinds of police state responses to humanitarian issues are going to continue. So yes, I agree. Yes, it's uncomfortable even in our circles, but I mean, the facts are there historically.
What words? I mean, I do not agree with using the words modern day slavery, because, like Michelle says, I mean, we just can't. We should not diminish what happened to a whole group of people, and is still happening. That is still happening. So what should we say instead, do you think, that describes the situation people are in, that that don't have options, like trafficked?
There is a range of
Exploited?
exploitation. I'm sorry.
Exploited, yeah, exploited
Yeah.
is a word. Yeah.
There is a range of exploitation. When I talk about labor, we usually use, let's talk about from just unfair practices to trafficking. Then I'll talk about labor, abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. I try to include all three terminologies so that people understand the different situations they can find themselves in. Because showing someone that they're in an exploitive or trafficking labor situation is very difficult sometimes, because in a capitalist society, people want their work and their jobs and they depend on them. So I think calling them by what they are and having people be aware of not only their situation, but identifying it, around them is important. So that is another reason I don't like personally the use of the term modern day slavery. It conjures up this image that you're not going to find. I tell my students at U of H, I have them either look up images or I show them images that come up in everyone's Google search, and it's always the bound, chained hand.
Oh,
the little girl with the black hand over her mouth. And I tell my students, what do these images say? It says you're not going to find them. It says that they're in this horrible situation that unless you sneak into a basement, you're not going to see them. It's not the person that you're just running into in an exploitative or traffic state that they're not aware of. And that's what we need to start realizing. So, I mean, I just say abuse, say exploitation, say trafficking, and in many cases, say violence.
you know, and I, when I left, and I don't want to get into this a lot, but when I left my job at the DA's office, the big reason I left was because I would not go along with their trafficking program. You know, how they were treating young women, and it was exclusively women. It was, you know, I believed it was very abusive and exploitative, and you know, I did my best to make changes, and it didn't go my way at all. And so that's actually one of the reasons I left my job. And within the system, the view for not everybody. Now, some people within the system really agreed with me and said, this is really terrible. We're really hurting these people. But I heard from top people at the DA's office when I talked about traumatizing you. So they would, you know, they would arrest young women and, you know, who were involved in commercial sex, and they would want to get information from them. And they did it in a variety of ways, and you know, they were almost all hurtful. And some people that I worked with really saw that, objected to it. But people high up in the office, I talked about the exploitation, and someone high up said, well, they're prostitutes. Like, that's the answer. Like, you know, either I don't know if this person meant they've been through so much trauma, so this doesn't really bother them, or it doesn't matter. I'm not sure, but either way is bad. And then a person who was greatly involved in directing the human trafficking programs, you know, I actually got pretty upset in a meeting, and I said, you know, every time these women are arrested, we're hurting them. Every time they come to court, we're hurting them. We are hurting them. And the person in charge said, it's a necessary evil. So there's no, I think for a while, I thought, well, if I just like raise awareness, they don't really realize what's happening. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. They're doing this. This is on purpose. So, you know, I just don't see how the criminal, you know, unfortunately, when we talk about human trafficking, when we think about criminal justice, we are talking almost exclusively about sex trafficking. And I think almost all their programs are hurting the people that they say they're supposed to be helping. Almost all. And it's ironic to me, you know, as we're talking about modern day slavery or exploitation, that not only are these people, you know, it's like Michelle said, you know, sometimes people like they have, you know, they come from poverty, they don't have options. So people are already in situations where, I don't know, you know, they need to label their own experiences, right? Whether it's exploitive or it's crummy work or whatever. And then we have a system that.
Wait a minute. Okay, so you're gonna have to change some dollar amounts. How much am I supposed to have? Yes,
It's $15 per hour.
Oh, yeah. So we have a system that takes these experiences that people have that are, you know, generally pretty awful, and just makes it worse. And, you know, just really, I think traps people, you know. So if we have a young woman say she's, you know, selling sex, and she gets arrested, now she has something on her record, and, you know, what kind of, you know, is she going to be applying for jobs? She's going to put that, you know, that's going to get in her way and keep her stuck in that system where she doesn't have options.
V, if it's okay, if I can tie this a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, go for it. For sure. The questions
to,
are just there in case there was silence. This is
Oh.
going great.
But how the system, the prison systems exploit the communities themselves. Well, first of all, I want to point out, I don't think something that's been said, but Ms. Johnson Bush pointed out a lot of things that you're not able to do, once you leave prison. And one of those rights that's taken is voting. However, you're still expected to pay taxes. So taxation without representation isn't a big issue when we're talking about convicts, right? People who have been incarcerated previously. But also, something else I identify with Ms. Johnson Bush. I'm also from, an impoverished background. I'm actually from the poorest town in Texas. One big thing here on the border is the building of prison systems and the promise of jobs, which is always held over, right? That promise of bringing money back into the community. So there's exploitation within those systems. I mean, I've seen other rural, impoverished communities where they close detention centers, where they close prisons, and everyone's against it. Everyone's upset by it because that took the only jobs that are being offered to them. Those aren't the only jobs out there. Those aren't the only things that can be offered and actually invested into the community. But these systems, that's how they make that profit. They can pay less in these communities. They can expect that available labor, applying and having their job fairs, and yet they're still exploiting the people in the prison as well. And yet putting so much of that labor within the people staying there themselves. It's just this huge juxtaposition. And no one seems to question it, all that matters is we're coming into a poor community, we're offering these jobs, and those people are going to fight tooth and nail to get those jobs and have that, source of funding into it. Nobody's questioning all the money that goes back to the highly profitable industries themselves.
I would like to just piggyback off of what the doctor said, Dr. Torres said, because, if you think about it, in slavery, the people who were policing the other field slaves were Black people. Were Black people. When you think about when they were stealing Black people, it was those who were captured in war. And so that then we're back to the systematic somehow identity shift that makes you okay with it. It makes you okay with it. And another thing that you had said that's so true, even within the prison system, you want to do the jobs. You want to get a job because it gives you something to do. It makes you feel human. I can show up and do something, and other than it kind of takes you out of where you are. I used to enjoy being out in the field because there we can see the sky and we're outside. We're not on our bunks. And so it's just a mental war to even find normalcy in there. So going to work often seems like something that you want to do, even if you're not getting paid, even if you're not, even if it's something you couldn't get me to do now. But while I was there, it was a source of joy. And so how do you balance that in your mind? How do you balance that in your emotions? It's so tied, it's really deep. That's all I can say.
Thank you everyone for sharing. I'll go ahead and ask the next question. So in the anti-human trafficking space, a lot of nonprofits focus their work on sex trafficking specifically. Why is labor trafficking in the prison system, outside of the prison system, an issue that more organizations should care about?
Because we all benefit from it. I mean, that to me is the simplest and easiest and very generalizable response. I think I shared this with you, that in class, when I would first teach it, I would have the first day focus on the history and policy, the second day on labor trafficking, third day on sex, fourth day on media, fifth day on social work and trafficking. And I always wish I could have videotaped the students discussing labor trafficking and then the start of the sex trafficking day. Because at the end of the Labor Day, everyone is just so overwhelmed. This is so huge. I didn't know that the shrimp I ate, had people killed, for it. I didn't think about the fact that I shouldn't be able to buy any fruit I want at any time of the year. And where is it coming from if it's not here, Um, the tilapia, a huge percentage of the tilapia we eat comes from prison labor. So everyone was just so overwhelmed. This is too much. I tried to do good and I bought an American made car. Oh yeah, but the parts and the minerals that were mined for it were actually from somewhere else where there was heavy exploitation. So it felt very overwhelming to say, I'm impacted by this, I'm a part of this, and now I have to do something about it. And then at the start of the sex trafficking day, there's just this huge shift of those are the monsters. That's awful. I have nothing to do with that. And then it becomes this othering, touching up a bit on, what you had said, Ms. Johnson Bush, about the first people to catch the slaves were their own, right? And I mean, we see that across the board in a lot of these situations because systemically we're pitted against each other. And if we fight against each other, we don't look up. We don't question. If we fight for that job in that prison system so I can have some sort of income, I'm not going to look up at who's profiting from it, making everyone else, suffer and exploit my community and my population. So I think it's, when it comes to labor trafficking, first of all, it's at least 3 times more prevalent than sex trafficking, and we all benefit from it. In a capitalist society, there's no ethical consumption. We all benefit from this. So yeah, it's easier to say, oh, those are the others, those are the monsters, those are the people that are exploiting, and not look at the hand that you have in it every single day.
I think it's also really important to focus on the labor trafficking that's happening in prisons specifically by calling out that this is state sanctioned, state approved, state supported trafficking that's happening. And I think we need to be looking at all of the ways that the government uses basically just performative rhetoric to kind of virtue signal about all of these atrocities that we say we're against, but then we actually engage in doing. Our government is complicit in human trafficking through the state-sanctioned labor trafficking that's happening in prisons. Our government is complicit in murder through the state-sanctioned executions that are happening through the death penalty. Our government is complicit in maintaining and perpetuating millions of people, including millions of children who live in poverty, by knowing that there are policy solutions to ameliorate poverty and choosing not to do anything about that. So the government is complicit in harm, and we need to be calling that out every time it happens.
Alan, I really like the way you said that. That really sums up what my experience was, which when I left my job, I just didn't understand, how is it that it's okay that we're hurting these people if we say that we're here to like prevent them from being hurt? But we are part of it. I mean, we were just, and not only were are, it's still going on. A lot of nonprofits are part of it. They partner with the police and the DA's office on these stings to like help people. But, I don't, and I know wonderful people who are doing that kind of work, and they try to, have good boundaries and not be part of it. But I just think this whole thing cannot be led by criminal justice. It's never going to get fixed. Now, I'm not talking about someone who abuses someone and like forces them to sell sex that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about going from, through the labor, the people that are doing the work of selling sex and exploiting them to try to supposedly end this problem. But thank you. That I really like the way you said that. And you're right. So many ways government is part of it, which is, what's the word for that? Paradox? Right word? Stupid? I mean, maybe that's another, I don't know, but like it just doesn't make sense. Thank you.
I had another word in mind, but this isn't my discussion. We'll move on to the next question. And if no one feels comfortable sharing, that is okay. But any knowledge on this topic, I think, would be interesting to hear from inside the prison system. So the next question is sex trafficking happening in the prison system, and how?
There have been reported cases, both among, I really hate this term, prisoners, those who are incarcerated, but even more so from those working in the systems, officers, the corrections officers, amongst, like, internally. It's difficult to bring people out or sneak people out, for the purposes, but happening internally. There have been some reported cases. I've heard more, not a lot, but from those who have unreported cases, and not usually. And this is something that I've thought is probably why it's really underreported. The exchange isn't usually money, especially if it's among incarcerated persons. It's always trading for something of need, which is a definition that we use especially for minors, trading sex for something of value, something for survival. So I have heard some reported and unreported cases of this going on. I couldn't tell you the prevalence. I don't think we ever could figure it out, because it would be so hidden. But I do believe that it goes on. I know it does.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I was not able to find a lot of research, but I did find an article on it, so I'll be sure to share that once the discussion is over with everyone. So the next question is, why is advocating for prison abolition advocating to prevent and end human trafficking?
I'd say, I think part of abolitionist praxis is it's the idea that preventing and ending trafficking requires addressing the different forms of marginalization that create vulnerability to trafficking, which is what abolition is all about. Ruth Wilson Gilmore always says that abolition is about presence as much as it is about absence. Abolition work is really about creating not just closing prisons, but creating conditions in society so that the need for prisons are obsolete. And when we do that, when we ensure that people have everything that they need to not just survive, but thrive in their communities, where they're not worried about where they're going to sleep, what they're going to eat, how they're going to feed their children, when we eliminate all of those vulnerabilities, we're also working towards, which is what abolition is about, then we're also working towards addressing and ending the vulnerabilities or the conditions that create vulnerability to trafficking.
Yes, thank you. It's definitely a very intersecting topic, and I think it's something that a lot of organizations forget, is addressing the intersecting vulnerabilities. Okay, and if we have any questions.
I'd just like to add to what Dean Detlaff said, but
Yeah,
I think the prison system, the carceral systems that we have today, and again, that includes detention of immigrants, it's for profit. Whether it's run by a for-profit corporation or not, this is a for-profit industry, and it's literally focused on the criminalizing poverty, which is one of the largest vulnerabilities for trafficking, and that's exploited, for labor, commercial sex, for profit for a trafficker. I mean, besides the actual legal connections between trafficking and prison labor, and abolishing that, if prison is supposed to be there, one of the reasons I'm an abolitionist is because I believe that the system is beyond reform. This idea that we have of what prison is today really needs to be done away with, and what we need to focus on, as Detlef said, is addressing those vulnerabilities, but also offering a restorative process, you know, in case there is anything that any kind of crime that's been committed, or you know, something that needs to be corrected. That's not what we do in these systems. We profit from them. We punish people. And again, we're doing it for a large majority of people who actually haven't even been convicted yet. So there's not a rehabilitative process that's offered there. There's not, again, if you're forced to work in these conditions, why can't you put that on your resume and say, hey, by the way, I have years of this experience doing this, and I should easily be able to get a job in that industry. But no, we now have a box that you have to check saying, yes, I was in prison, but not everything I learned from there, because it's not a program meant to help rehabilitate you and give you options when you get out. So I think it's very intersectional, and we need to address all those kinds of systems and look at a system that says, you know, this is something beyond reform, and we need to rethink it all over.
I agree. And, you know, people with chronic and severe mental health issues should not be, you know, waiting to get arrested to get help. You know, people should have access to these systems early and easy to prevent them from being in a situation where they, you know, the police may even be involved. And I think especially in this state where we don't like to pay for anything, what happens is, and I see this as unfair for people in the criminal justice system, it rolls down there. It ends up there. Mental health issues, substance abuse, or substance use issues, it ends up there, and that system is not equipped to handle these issues. But that's where we put our money. So then we end up, providing treatment for substance use. We have all these programs within our criminal justice system that people can't get to outside of the criminal justice system. That's really messed up. Why is that? It's like, everybody's been saying, it's because we make choices. We make choices about, where our public money goes and who we support. And it just shouldn't be, I feel very strongly, having worked in the system, that the system should not be treating substance use, mental health issues. Now, I understand people may get arrested for, maybe someone's being violent with someone, but, for the most part, if the driving, if the driving force is untreated mental health issues, they don't belong there, because because the system is never going to treat that person as, they don't have the ethics, say, that social workers have, about care and boundaries and treatment and even understanding what needs to happen. It's something that it's a broken way of handling it, and it just makes it worse. And I agree with you. We've got to take it out of there. Take it out of there. Thank you.
I know you may recall, and as probably one of the only panelists who's been incarcerated, it probably sounds funny coming out of my mouth. I just think it has to be a gradual process. And because the United States we have more incarcerated people than any other country. That's what we do.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we know it's big business. But I think that if we're going to be looking at the total, to really get rid of the prison systems, we would have to start looking at the root causes, where the social service programs, just like the gentleman shared, social service projects, we're going to have to start looking at more human welfare and what keeps people from recommitting crimes. But right now, I think the proportional, make punishment more proportional. I mean, as someone who's seen family members and for shoplifting, for maybe even welfare fraud.
Oh my God.
Yeah. There
was a guy in charge of welfare fraud for years.
Mm-hmm.
made it his personal mission to
Mhm.
go after people. Yeah.
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 So there has to be, if we're going to abolish prisons, there has to be a reinvestment of that money into social projects that, you know, gear us from high incarceration rates to high healing rates. I do understand that drug addict, I believe, and this, I think that substance abuse and mental health issues, just like you said, are the primary reason we see a lot of people in the system, because they're the throwaways. No one knows what to do with them, and there's not enough resources to address. As working for 211, I get a lot of calls for people who need homeless shelters, people who need alcohol and drug treatment, and these facilities are packed.
Yep.
I mean, they have to wait till someone cycles out to go in, and so until then, they're out there, you know. And so it just, while I can agree with the concept, I think it's just going to be a process. It would have to really be a process, because I know people who I was incarcerated with who, if we're free, we're wanting to do another crime, you know. So there's a disconnect there. When are we going to address the real underlying issues, the poverty, you know, the sexual abuse that's rampant in some of our communities? That when you incarcerate a parent, you're leaving children unraised. The CPS system then groups them in homes. Even with our brown brothers and sisters, when they were massively incarcerating the children, you know, and they now, I was watching the news, and they were talking about now they have where if you come over as a family, our governor is saying that only the children, if you come as a child, you can come in. If you come without your parents. So I think that's all geared toward reprogramming the mind and taking out your culture. And so it's really hard to wrap my mind around a world where there would be no, I don't think we're saying no punishment for crime, but the way we could go about it could change. I just don't know that process. I don't know the answer to that.
You all have made some really excellent points, and that has led to some questions that I want to make sure that we are able to address. One of those is, how can we advocate for prison abolition when anti-human trafficking work significantly intersects with law enforcement systems and structures and are oftentimes funded by those very systems?
That's a topic I'm really familiar with. The answer is we can't. They, you know, the helping systems cannot, you know, the way it works is, you know, so a lot of at least now I've been gone 2 years. I doubt it's changed that much, but you know, a lot of you know, the leaders of groups, you know, meetings would be held in criminal justice settings. So it's very much criminal justice driven. And I do, having worked on the ground in this system, I do not believe that they belong together. Except, so unless it's a system where, say, the police are referring, so, you know, like referring to Hawk, Houston Area Women's Center, and there's no like interaction, like, you know, here's some place, you know, some people that could provide services, and they're not involved, you know, there's no back and forth sharing information, you know, maybe something like that. But even when criminal justice, like when individuals want to do the right thing, the system is never going to allow them to do that. The system is always going to do what the system does, in my opinion.
I think that for it to be effective, that the people who have been affected by it have to have a say in what it looks like.
Absolutely.
Like, if you're, you know, I think that if we're dealing with, like, Second Cup is a wonderful, wonderful organization, because it takes the women that have been healed from sex trafficking, who have seen barriers overcome, whether it's mental, financial, and they address all of those. Then they sit on panels, and then they get to say what helped them. You have to involve those affected. And see, what we do a lot of times is these government systems, and then the higher ups, the administrators, and those who are with who are more paternalizing. They see you as their child, and I'm going to fix you, or patronizing. You're my slave, and you're going to do what I say. They come in and never ask the victims what they need. And so the only way I think to be effective in helping anyone, whether it be in social work or in any barrier, overcoming any barrier they have, you have to ask them what they need, what they want. So I would think that there would have to be a meeting of the minds between those who have suffered from I guess we're going to say modern day slavery, and those who've been trafficked, and to say what they would have needed, what they needed in order to overcome that, and then allocate money toward that. Right. You know, whether it was PTSD classes, I don't know. You know, I don't know, but I definitely know that the people who are affected have to have a voice.
100%, 100%. And Second Cup is it's a wonderful example. You know, they're not out there on police operations helping people, right? Like, it's like they're doing their own thing, and, you know, people can choose how they get involved in a variety of ways. And I think that's the direction. I think you're absolutely.
I think something we need to push for as well is really holding legislators accountable. And this is a tactic of removing that voting right for people who have formerly been incarcerated. That is a tactic of controlling what they say in that representation and what actually happens in any kind of reform or any kind of legislative change that's necessary. But holding them accountable, not just for the way these systems are working and who's profiting, but also where those funds are going. One of the only federal funds that come for researching and responding to trafficking is through a criminal justice lens. And you have to work very closely with criminal justice for that. And I mean, research has shown time and time again that it doesn't work effectively, especially because criminal justice, the field itself, has this huge blind side, or I don't know if it's apathy towards labor trafficking, which is far more prevalent. So again, there's only a specific type of trafficking that's being looked for, and there's a very perfect victim that's being looked for within that specificity.
100%.
So that needs to be brought in, that people's feet need to be held to the fire, and saying, okay, you know what, these are what the actual issues are. These are the people who actually need this assistance, and in getting out of these precarious situations, and then addressing those vulnerabilities is what needs to happen. And so telling people this isn't the one answer, this isn't the answer for a humanitarian issue, is what needs to happen more, versus this usual very American response of criminal justice and the police are the response to everything. I know this sounds stupid, but the other night I saw a video of a woman calling a 911, and it should have been an animal control issue, like a raccoon ran into her house. And my husband, who's from another country, was like, does that actually happen? I said, yes, people will call the police thinking that's the first responder and the savior for everything. And yeah. You know, he couldn't wrap his mind around that. But there is that mentality of like, you know, some people feel very safe with that one response. And so that's a generalized approach, and that's not true. And not everyone feels safe with that approach. Not everyone trusts the police. Not everyone trusts policing tactics, and policing isn't inclusive of everyone, even in the legislative and tactics that are used in enforcement.
That point actually bridges really well to another question. Is there any legislation around prison reform or that could address some of the tactics that you mentioned, Dr. Torres?
I'm not familiar with legislation for any prison reform here in Texas. I would doubt it, to be honest. I don't know if Dean Butleft has a better landscape of that.
No, not that I know of. I don't know of any prison reforms, and you know, prison reform efforts are ultimately not addressing the root cause of harm that prisons cause. So it's, I mean, that's not. I don't even think we should be looking for reforms, you know, because reforms usually just expand the size and scope and reach of prisons. We should be looking for what's really going to shrink the size and scope ultimately working towards a future without prisons. So I mean, there's not prison reforms, but usually the prison reforms that are going to be suggested are in actuality just going to expand the system rather than shrink it. So we need to be looking at the ways that really do shrink.
I think the only thing that changed in DDLF, you may know more about this than I do, but under the new administration, there was one legislative change about, I think any government contracts were cut from certain prison corporations. But when you looked at who was actually cut from it, this was marketed as like a reform. But when you actually looked at who was cut and who had those contracts anyway, it was like less than 3% of the overall prison industry. So there's nothing reformative about it. A lot of it was performative and saying, you know, this is what we are standing up to. We're listening to the people who are either saying defund or abolish the carceral systems. It didn't make a major change.
It's always performative. And that's what I think we need to be really questioning when we hear about these things.
And it also assumes that the system is okay, except for like we just need to make some tweaks, or we need to, you know, it just assumes we keep going as we're going, and that doesn't work.
Thank you. There was a comment that I want to acknowledge that there are groups who are engaging in mutual aid around trafficking that help to minimize involvement with the justice system. And the last question that I would love for our panelists to touch on as we wrap up is what can individuals and nonprofits, organizations do now? What now?
I'm sorry, was that like a generalizable what now or specifics to certain fields? Just want to clarify.
Yeah, we would love to leave with an action that anyone here is able to move forward with.
I want to say, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, you go.
One immediate action I can say, and this is more research-based coming out of a lot of the studies that we've done with, especially, you know, social workers. A lot of people say that they know a lot of people have received the training. The state has now mandated that you have to get trained on human trafficking. But when it comes to actually having, sorry, my puppy, a protocol in place to respond, that's where everyone, you know, they either just revert to mandated reporting for children, which is its own issue, or, you know, just kind of notching off. We found someone who had been trafficked before and really didn't have a response. Anyone who's actually working in this field, to clarify this field, I would say have a protocol in place, network with your local organizations, because one good way of not immediately jumping into the criminal justice system is having advocates. And a lot of organizations already working in trafficking have community advocates that know how to work with them. If they don't, you know, if there does have to be some kind of like police report, they know how to work with them to where, you know, they're not re-traumatized by law enforcement or, you know, similar situations. Broadly, again, I'll come back to holding people's feet to the fire, demanding that vulnerabilities be addressed, naming what is happening, abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and violence. I'm someone who actually believes that poverty is a systemic choice and is also a sort of state-sanctioned violence. And so speaking up on the criminalization and the profiting off of others' poverty that puts them at risk for trafficking.
I guess I'll go. I love poverty is a systemic choice. I put that in the chat. I love that. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think, and, you know, Michelle touched on it. It's, you know, whatever the mission of your, you know, wherever you work is, but working on those basic things that help people be self-sustainable, and, you know, including the way that they, you know, feel about themselves and see themselves, and, you know, helping people to, you know, to be part of society. Like, you know, Melissa, you mentioned you know, the voting. I think that's just so, isn't that so excluding? Like, you can't be part of society. You can't have a voice. I mean, I think, you know, advocating for things like that. And specifically, if we're talking about sex trafficking, don't work with the police. And, you know, I come from someone who ran those kind of programs, and, you know, I just think it's a disaster unless it's very hands off, you know, here's a referral kind of thing. And then the agency takes you know, helps the person. But I think a lot of these things that we, you know, that are pretty basic. How do we help people be self-sustainable? And I'll just throw in here, you know, since I've been in private practice for a couple of years, you know, one of the big things that I talk to people about and we're working on is trauma. And trauma is, you know, that's the thing that's driving, you know, the substance use. It's a big part of a lot of mental health issues. You know, if you're out there in an agency and you can help people, you know, heal from their trauma, I think that if we're, you know, just talking about individual help, I think that is something that's really important. There's a lot of hurting people out there. Thank you.
Also specific to sex work, we should be advocating for, or sex trafficking, we should all be advocating for decriminalization of sex work. Because
oh yes, I can't even believe I didn't say that, Alan. Thank you. I almost feel like that just goes without saying, but oh my God, yes, yes.
Decriminalization of sex work would lead to great reductions in trafficking. So that's something we should all be advocating for.
Oh, absolutely.
So if I can actually add to that, as far as that systemic lens, funding that comes from Department of Justice for victim services, again, a criminal justice department, federal, actually says that if you receive funds to provide services for victims of sex trafficking, you cannot advocate for the decriminalization of sex work, which is another systemic speed bump there for any kind of advocacy for the people that are actually impacted by this situation. So again, it's there's ways of controlling, you know, who says what and whose voice is heard.
And then,
Go ahead, Michelle.
well, I guess what I can say to it, if what I can do personally, what we can do personally is invest in programs that are more thriving than surviving. When I do my donations to nonprofits, I do believe that they help. I believe that that when you have a community-based resource, it's available to those who are around. Most nonprofits help their neighbors, and that's where it has to start. It has to start at a grassroots level. So when I think about investing my donation dollars, I look at programs that are aimed at helping people to get a livable wage, helping people to improve their communities so that they don't have to make those hard choices between, you know, doing the right and the wrong thing, and that they can focus on, you know, higher thought, education, taking care of their kids, you know, those kind of things. And also, I think that I think one of the things that has to be said, and it's been said over and over, the prison system is doing exactly what it's designed to do.
Yep.
Exactly what it's designed to do. And it is breaking down brown and black people. And many people can fall into that, but it is working. So you can't reform a system that's working right up to what it's supposed to be doing. That's why it was created, and that's what it's for. So on that note, that's all I have to say. So it's not about prison reform for me. It's just, it's working. The system is working.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you all so much for sharing your insight, your experiences, your expertise on this topic. We at A Second Cut believe that we can't talk about, and this was emphasized over and over again by you all, that we can't talk about these issues like human trafficking without recognizing the intersection of race and identity and origin. And so we really appreciate you shedding light on this topic and for providing some responses that we can have as a community. We are going to save this conversation. It'll be accessible on our website. All technology fingers crossed. And will also be anyone who registered for the event, we're going to send out a summary of the conversation in a one-page with some next action steps. So again, thank you all so much for being
Thank
here.
you.
And I want to thank you. And I want to just give it really quickly to V for the final end.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking through. I really appreciated everyone's time, perspective, comments, expertise. And I am sharing a few links in the chat for you all to continue reading. If this is a topic that really interests you, I know it's definitely a passion of mine. Thanks to Doctora Torres and my experience with her in her course. And
Awesome.
I do want to leave everyone with the quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that Dean Detlef mentioned earlier in the chat, which is abolition is about presence, not absence. It is about building life-affirming institutions. And if I want to reiterate anything, is that in all the work that we do, we should be focusing on creating life-affirming institutions, spaces, relationships, connections. I think that if we all function from that space, we can definitely start to see some things change within our communities. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Dee.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thank you. Good
Bye,
night.
everyone.